Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Power You Have. I'm your host, Pramila Jayapal, and I'm so glad to be with you today. This is our third episode of the podcast. I just want to thank everyone that has tuned in and shared the podcast with your friends. This podcast is all about staying engaged in this incredibly difficult time that we live in and turning our fear and our outrage into action. I started this show to remind all of us that in good times and in bad, we still have power. We can't let anyone take it away from us. It belongs to us, and we can use that power we have to change the current reality. We have the ability to put our hands on that moral arc of the universe and bend it more quickly towards justice, in the words of the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So, with every episode, I'm bringing you into conversation with people who have tapped into that power and are using it. People who have ideas on how you can use your power too. This week, our guest is my own Washington State Attorney General, Nick Brown, who's been on the front lines of taking on Donald Trump's unlawful and unconstitutional actions. He's got a lot to say about this, and we're going to bring him in just a minute. But before we do, I have to give you a quick update on what happened in Washington, D.C. last week. Last Thursday, July 3rd, Republicans jammed through their big, bad betrayal budget bill with barely a vote to spare. In the Senate, Vice President J.D. Vance had to cast a tie-breaking vote because 3 Republican senators voted no: Rand Paul, Susan Collins, Tom Tillis. Rand Paul voted no because the bill dramatically increases America's debt by $5 trillion. And Collins and Tillis voted no because of the massive cuts to Medicaid and health care that would throw 17 million Americans off of their health care. Senator Tillis, a Republican who represents North Carolina, was the most honest. He even handed out a sheet of paper that documented the massive cuts to health care that would negatively affect his state and many other Republican states. And he gave a passionate floor speech against the bill. So you don't have to just take it from me. Take it from him. Here's what he said. What do I tell 663,000 people in 2 years or 3 years when President Trump breaks his promise by pushing them off of Medicaid because the funding is not there anymore? I think the people in the White House advising the president are not telling him that the effect of this bill is to break a promise. End quote. That was Senator Tom Tillis, a Republican in the Senate who voted no on the big bad betrayal bill. And he's absolutely right. Trump has broken promise after promise. In the House, only 2 Republicans voted against the bill, and it passed by just 1 vote. Despite so many Republicans in some of the toughest districts in the country knowing that it was terrible for their constituents, that it would shutter rural hospitals and nursing homes and drive up costs for working people and poor people, and yet they still voted yes. Just imagine that Republicans used this budget reconciliation bill, which only requires a simple majority, bypassing the filibuster in the Senate, to strip health care, to slash nutrition assistance for hungry people, to kill over 1 million jobs, to eliminate the clean energy tax credits, as well as the student loan repayment plans that we Democrats had established in the last couple of years. Now, look, in 2022, when Democrats had the majorities in the House, the Senate, and the White House, we used that budget reconciliation process to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest ever investment into clean energy and lowering our country's emissions, an investment into lowering the cost of prescription drugs by allowing Medicare to negotiate drug costs with Big Pharma, and all of this while helping to reduce the deficit by making big corporations and the wealthiest pay more of their fair share. When we had the majority, we used our power to help people save money, create jobs, and make the wealthiest people and biggest corporations pay their more of their fair share. Republicans, on the other hand, the exact opposite. Who does their big bad betrayal bill benefit, and who does it harm? Who are the winners and the losers? Let's look first at the winners. Starting in 2029, people making $30,000 a year or less would see a tax increase, while the top 0.1% of wealthiest Americans would get a $309,000 tax cut on average. That is an annual tax break that is more than 3 times what the typical American household earns in an entire year. Another big winner? Private, for-profit immigration detention companies. The big bad betrayal bill supercharges ICE's kidnapping and disappearing of people of all legal statuses, including U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents. It pumps $42 billion, billion, into private, for-profit detention facilities. That's 13 times increase to what we currently spend on ICE detention. And by the way, it's more than the entire amount that we spend on the Bureau of Prisons. This bill will just increase the massive sweeps and the raids and undermine even more the critical due process protections that every person in this country is afforded by our Constitution. There are a bunch of other winners too, like gun manufacturers who no longer have to pay a gun silencer tax, or giant corporations who want to shield their earnings and pay 0 taxes. What about the losers? The American people who will be left sicker and poorer by this big bad betrayal bill. That's how they're paying for these tax cuts for the wealthiest. They're slashing and burning the health care, the nutrition assistance for working and poor Americans. 17 million Americans will lose health care. Rural hospitals and nursing homes will shut down. $186 billion of the supplemental nutrition program is slashed so that hungry Americans won't be able to get the tiniest amount of $2 a meal. That's what SNAP provides, $2 a meal. And the Congressional Budget Office estimates that all of this is going to add $3.9 trillion to federal deficits over the next 10 years. Now, Republicans want to argue that they're not, quote, cutting people off of health care or nutrition assistance. They're just adding in so-called work requirements. What does that mean? It's basically a bunch of red tape that says if you want to maintain your health coverage or your nutrition assistance, you have to prove that you worked or studied 80 hours each month. And you have to go through this bureaucratic bullshit every single month. And if you don't do that, you get kicked off of healthcare. You get kicked off of your nutrition assistance. Now, I want to make something really, really clear. Study after study has shown that people who can physically work are already working. That adding these kinds of bureaucratic requirements does absolutely nothing to get more people working. It's just red tape to dress up the fact that they are kicking people off of coverage who desperately need it. We've seen it happen. In Arkansas, when they imposed these so-called work requirements on Medicaid, 18,000 people were disenrolled in just 4 months before a court order halted the implementation. And I want to just talk about SNAP. This is America's nutrition assistance program. In the richest country in the world, why do we even have hungry people? That is not a personal failure of individuals. That's a failure of policy. $2 a meal. That's what families get through SNAP. And just imagine that in my home state alone, almost 1 million Washingtonians are hungry and enrolled in SNAP, about 11% of the state's population, in a place where Jeff Bezos got so rich that he just spent $50 million on a wedding in Venice. Meanwhile, our state puts out an annual roster of the corporations that have the most employees on Medicaid. That's healthcare paid for with taxpayer dollars. And guess who's number 1 and number 2 on that roster? Walmart is number 1, and, yep, Amazon is number 2. So while Bezos makes bazillions in personal wealth, Amazon is not even paying people enough that they can afford healthcare. The big bad betrayal bill cuts SNAP by 1/3. Kicking an estimated 3 million people across this country off of nutrition assistance. It also ends a lot of the green energy pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act. It ends tax credits for new and used electric vehicles, ends the installation of home EV charging equipment and insulation or energy efficient heating and cooling systems. These were provisions that helped our families to lower their energy costs and helped to lower our carbon footprint. It was a win-win. That's not all. The bill also creates a pay-to-play scheme for polluters, dropping the royalty rates that fossil fuel companies pay to develop public lands to rates lower than they have been at any point since the 1920s. These provisions are a ruthless giveaway to the fossil fuel industry at a time when oil and gas companies are already making a killing. And by the way, we're going to deprive rural communities of the funding that they rely on for basic infrastructure. Now, the bill also requires onshore oil and gas lease sales on federal lands in western states over the next 10 years. It amends the Mineral Leasing Act to make more lands available for leasing, and it undermines the ability for environmental protections and community concerns to factor into lease approvals. The bill also requires a new breakneck pace for lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico, again, with no guardrails to protect the environment, and it undercuts important programs that ports like our own Port of Seattle use to work to improve air quality and reach zero emissions. So, what does this all mean? It means now we have to do the work to make sure Americans know what is in the big bad betrayal bill. Because all of the polling tells us that once Americans know what is in it, they are against it 2-1 across party preference. But a lot of people still don't know. And Trump and Republicans are lying all day long. They don't want you to know all the ways that they are scamming you, including, by the way, delaying some of the worst cuts until after next year's midterm elections so that you will vote for them again. So it's our job to hold them accountable, to write letters to the editor, to write op-eds, to go on podcasts, to go to our places of worship and community centers and schools and talk about what's in this bill. Call the Republicans who voted for it. Make it the most unpopular thing in the world so that we vote those Republicans out, we take back the House, and we restore fairness for people. That's the work. We need you to use your power to fight back. That brings us now to our guest on this show, someone who is using his power and his platform to fight for all of our rights. Washington State Attorney General Nick Brown began his legal career in the Army JAG Corps. That's like being a public defender for our soldiers in the Army. Later, as lead counsel for former Washington State Governor Jay Inslee, Nick oversaw the governor's work to end the death penalty, and he fought back against unlawful actions in Trump's first term, including the Muslim ban. From 2021 to 24, Nick served as the U.S. Attorney for Western Washington, and in 2024, we in Washington State were lucky enough to elect him as our Attorney General. He was elected Attorney General in 2024, and in his first 6 months as AG, he has led and joined dozens of lawsuits against the administration. Attorney General Nick Brown, thank you so much for being on my show, The Power You Have.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to be here. There's so much to talk about in terms of the lawsuits that you have led and joined.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to start with birthright citizenship. On Trump's first day in office, he signed an executive order attempting to end birthright citizenship. This is the basic concept that if you're born in the United States, you are a United States citizen. And you immediately, I think it was the very next day, you filed a lawsuit with other states. And I was hoping that you could just tell our listeners who may not have been following this issue, the central question about, what Trump is claiming he can do, and then where the lawsuit is, because there's been a lot of developments, including other lawsuits that have been filed as well. And what should people know about what this means for us as Americans?
Yeah, well, I think it's a good place to start. I mean, we just filed our 25th lawsuit in less than 6 months of being in office. But the very first one was challenging this original executive order that on its face was blatantly unconstitutional. And to your question about what is this about, this is about what it means to be an American.
Yeah.
I mean, it is that basic. And the president, with the stroke of a pen, attempted to rewrite the common constitutional understanding, the rule of the law of the land for the last 150 years, overriding multiple Supreme Court precedents, because this is his idea that he gets to decide what it means to be an American. So birthright citizenship, in a very basic sense, is the premise that if you're born in America, with very few exceptions, that you are granted citizenship. We are not the only country in the world to do this, but we are one of the ones that has made it the way we define citizenship. The president's executive order basically directed the administration to no longer recognize that principle and to direct that newborn children under certain circumstances here in America would not get things like Social Security numbers and other rights and benefits and freedoms that comes with being American. So we filed a lawsuit with another coalition of states on the second day of his administration. It was a little surreal for me as a new attorney general to sign a lawsuit suing the president of the United States.
You knew it was coming because it was in Project 2025.
It had been
signaled.
A lot of credit to my predecessor and attorney general's offices across the country. We were prepared for this moment because we had done the work, we had done the research, we were looking at Project 2025. Despite all the claims that the president made that he didn't know anything about it, it's clearly been their playbook for so many actions in these first 6 months. We analyzed the things that were being said on the campaign trail by President Trump and his team. And Washington State had taken a leadership role amongst all the attorney generals in the country to analyze and review some of the immigration-related policies that they were talking about on the campaign trail. So we were ready for this possibility, as well as some of the other things we've seen. And so we could bring a lawsuit very early because we had already hired an expert to help us prepare. We had already written draft briefs. We had already circulated that across the country with our colleagues in other offices. So we were prepared for that moment. We immediately went to court here in the Western District of Washington and got a temporary restraining order from a Reagan-appointed judge.
Judge Kuhnauer.
Judge Kuhnauer, who
Incredible opinion.
Yeah, really very clear.
Very strong.
Yeah. I mean, to sit in that courtroom and to see a judge who's been on the bench for 40-something years and say this is one of the most blatantly unconstitutional orders that he's ever seen. Yeah. We were back a few weeks later to get a preliminary injunction, which affirmed his prior ruling. And then that was one of many cases that arose across the country. New Jersey and Massachusetts led a similar case on the East Coast, and then two other independent groups advocating for people specifically brought cases as well. So there are 4 total cases. The district court judges in every single one of those cases agreed with what Judge Kuhnauer said out here in Seattle, that this is unconstitutional. The administration, the DOJ, opposed it and appealed. And what they did, though, however, in advancing it so quickly to the Supreme Court, is that they didn't challenge the merits. Yeah. What they did was to try to challenge the appropriateness of nationwide injunctions. So when Judge Kuhnauer issued his order, he made it illegal, essentially, for the entire country. That the administration's order did not apply in Washington, but it didn't apply anywhere, which makes sense because citizenship does not depend on which state you live in. Right. It depends on what the national standard is. And so he made a nationwide injunction. It's the same thing that the judge in Massachusetts and Maryland and elsewhere did. But the administrations challenged that. So we went up to the Supreme Court in May and heard arguments on that. It was my first time being in the Supreme Court to see arguments. It was a pretty powerful experience. Yeah. And, watching those arguments, it was pretty silly to me that the administration was standing on this principle that, in fact, you wouldn't apply this injunction nationwide. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court at the very last day of their term and said, in fact, no, it does not apply nationwide. That the injunction only applies to those states that brought challenges or for the individual plaintiffs that were impacted by it. And their theory essentially is that in order to get nationwide relief, you have to bring class actions or further demonstrate on the record that it impacts people more broadly than the judges had already done, which is kind of crazy because it means that, only if you're able to certify a class action lawsuit, which traditionally is very challenging, only if you're able to afford a lawyer and go to court, and we're talking about people often without the resources, the familiarity with our court system, the experience, the savvy to bring lawsuits, let alone lawsuits challenging an order by the President of the United States. But that is what the court ruled, and they limited, therefore, nationwide injunctions, not only in this case, but really setting a precedent for a bunch of other cases. We will be back eventually in front of the Supreme Court on the actual substantive issue about whether or not you can simply override birthright citizenship through an executive order, or whether you have to go through to amend the Constitution. In the meantime, since that court's order, 2 other plaintiffs groups brought class action lawsuits seeking essentially the same end result, a nationwide injunction. It wouldn't surprise me whether they get that result in the next couple weeks, because there's so many thousands of people that are impacted by this. It's much easier in this case, somewhat ironically, to define the class. But regardless of that, I feel confident still, and having confidence in the Supreme Court is not always a positive thing. But I feel confident, at least on this issue, that when it gets back to the courts on the merits, that the court is not going to overturn multiple Supreme Court precedents. They're not going to overturn, the weight of academic and legal authority on this, and they're going to reaffirm that has been the law of the land since the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that citizenship depends on only where you're born and not based on some other idea that the president has.
Yeah. It's been really interesting because obviously this was not on the merits, but this whole idea of stopping nationwide injunctions is something that has come through the Judiciary Committee as well. There have been bills that have come forward. And the argument that my Republican colleagues make all the time is, well, it's unfair that so many nationwide injunctions have been filed against this president. And I have said, if you don't like nationwide injunctions, don't do unconstitutional illegal things. It is not related to, well, this many got filed under this president versus this many under the previous president. It really is about any president that tries to overstep their authority. That's when nationwide injunctions get filed.
Well, listen, I don't think nationwide injunctions are proponents of nationwide injunctions aren't necessarily conservative or liberal or progressive or. It runs the gamut, and there are good reasons to, I think, put some parameters on how we use nationwide injunctions. But when you're talking about core constitutional provisions, like what it means to be an American, it's really absurd. If you live in Washington and you go to Idaho, if you're a pregnant person living in Spokane and you happen to travel to Boise for the day and you give birth there, what the department is saying, what the administration is saying is that that your child may not be an American because you happen to be in Idaho that day, which is silly. And we need, citizenship to be a nationwide standard because states rely on that determination. Social Security numbers give you healthcare benefits and education benefits. I mean, think about all the times that as a parent you use your child's Social Security number. But if you live in Idaho and when this order takes effect in a couple weeks, your child is not going to get one if you're an undocumented resident of Idaho. And, then how are you going to define what benefits that child does not get?
And what happens to all those people? Because if they're not citizens of here, and there are many other places where you
might be stateless or countryless.
Huge numbers of people.
Or if you're born in Idaho and then you come to Washington.
And all of a sudden you're protected versus not.
How does that work? And the administration has yet to explain how we would actually administer this program. And I think they can't.
And what do you think the timing will be, just in terms of our case moving forward, or any case on this issue?
Well, as the Supreme Court briefing went on, we continued in the Ninth Circuit. So we briefed and argued that on the merits in the Ninth Circuit. They paused that until the Supreme Court was making their decision. As soon as the Supreme Court issued their order, they directed us to do further briefing, which we're going to file in 2 or 3 days. And so that will continue to proceed. In Washington, you're fine. Because, and this is a really important point for me, is that whether or not you get these benefits depended on whether or not you had a Democratic Attorney General. Because if you didn't, like Idaho or Montana or a lot of our regional states, then you'd be screwed. You'd be screwed. Your citizenship is going to determine or depend on the president's decision, not Supreme Court precedent.
Well, you have been incredibly busy in your first couple of months. Just a few weeks after you filed that lawsuit, you led another lawsuit challenging Trump's order criminalizing and ending funding for gender-affirming care, another incredibly important issue. Talk about why you did that, and also what's the current status of that case?
Yeah, well, and that was a case where there was a smaller coalition of Democratic AGs, and every attorney general's got to make their own decision about how to join cases, and I don't fault anybody, but it was a smaller coalition. But it was important for me for a few reasons. One is simply because what the president did was illegal and unconstitutional. And if you want to debate the merits about how we provide health care and how we fund certain things, there's ways to do that through Congress, through passing bills. But the president, again, can't simply make that determination on his own and issue executive orders illegally cutting funding to Washington institutions. So first and foremost, it was just plainly illegal to me, putting aside the merits. But on the merits, we were talking about health care for children. And, and I have interfaced with parents and children who are going through transgender healthcare issues or going through transition healthcare needs. And what we started to hear immediately was how what the president did was going to lead to children dying because of their physical health impacts, because of their mental health impacts. And we were faced with so many stories about that immediately. Yeah. And doing nothing just did not seem like an option to me. And, on top of that, Washington State has been a national leader
on this issue.
This issue. The University of Washington in particular, other healthcare facilities here. And so the amount of cuts that we were going to face were going to be particularly harmful to Washington. And also, there was something particularly offensive to me, in addition to just the pure funding cuts, is that the executive order was threatening criminal penalties against doctors and parents who were going through this with their children. And that was
all the medical staff, as I understand it, anyone who was involved in providing care. Yep. So that's all the way down to the people who, are assisting on a surgery.
It was such an abuse of authority and power, and all at the expense of children. And we couldn't abide by that. And again, I think reasonable people can have a substantive disagreement about a whole host of issues, but there's a way to do that. Yeah. And the way that he was doing it was not only illegal, but it was particularly harmful and damaging to Washington.
Well, I've been amazed at all of my colleagues on the other side who seem to be willing to just give up congressional authority. Jamie Raskin, who's a colleague of mine and he's the ranking member on Judiciary, constitutional law professor, scholar. He always points out to everyone when they say we're co-equal branches of government, he says, wait a second. Not true, because actually Article 1 is very thick. Right. All of the powers that are attributed to Congress, and Article 2, which is presidential, is pretty thin. Right. And so all this executive order action from Donald Trump is actually undermining all of our authority, appropriations authority, policy authority in Congress, and is really, I think, very problematic for the operation of our country in our checks and balances. Also in two separate challenges, you led a group of states arguing against the Department of Education's mental health funding cuts, and you also challenged the administration's illegal funding cuts and delays to medical and public health research. Obviously, we are very proud in Washington State to have such a robust public health and research of public health funding here. But this is an issue across the country. Talk about the impact that those cuts can have on people here in our state, across the country, on their day-to-day lives, but also in what it means for the coming years and decades.
Yeah, well, on the first one, in 2019, Congress, you were there, Congress passed a bill in the wake of the tragedy in Texas and Uvalde to essentially fund many more mental health counselors and professionals in school districts across the country, because we know that our children are suffering and dealing with trauma and not knowing how to resolve problems. And so we put into our schools, including schools here in Washington, mental health care facility professionals. What the president's administration then tried to do in this last couple of months was threaten that funding and cut it from school districts across the country, again, in disregard for congressional authority. And, your colleagues on the other side of the bench weren't going to do anything about that. The threats were illegal, and they were going to be immediately damaging to school kids here in Washington. There were 90 school districts in Washington that were going to lose funding that they need, that hires professionals in their schools. And the irony of it for me was pretty stark because, every time there's a gun tragedy in this country, what we hear from Republicans is that guns aren't the problem, but it's mental health issues and it's other issues except for firearms. All right, well, here was a solution that Congress passed. The president signed a law providing mental health services to our children,
which are needed in every state,
which
Republican,
are needed for,
Democratic.
Yeah. I mean, and for the Congress to roll over on that and the president to go, abuse his authority. It just would make our schools less safe. And so we challenged that. We're leading that case with a smaller coalition of attorney generals. Immediately got some initial relief, which is great. In the second set of cases, again, they were cutting research funding for medical institutions, public health institutions. University of Washington, again, is one of the biggest researchers in the country. But it's not just UW. I mean, on that case, on the case we brought challenging the NIH cuts, there were institutions on both sides of the state, Washington State University, University of Washington, that are receiving hundreds of millions of dollars in funding to do things like cancer research and, things that are keeping people safe.
I was just over in Eastern Washington at the WSU campus, and, they're doing such amazing work there. And so much of it is going to be affected by all these cuts.
Oh, yeah. I mean, our lawsuits in the last 6 months have saved Washingtonians billions of dollars, which I always want to point out because the critique I get a lot from my critics are, why are you spending taxpayer dollars on these things? Like, all right, let's talk about how many taxpayer dollars we've saved.
Right.
It's billions of dollars in 6 months.
Incredible.
That would have been cut
Millions
from
of jobs.
Oh, yeah.
As well.
And the work that they're doing, which is life-saving work.
Right.
So, public health issues, mental health funding, Department of Education funding for our transportation projects and climate resistance projects, all that would have been cut but for actions of our office and other offices across this country.
We've talked about a lot of federal cases, but you also are doing something very important at the state level. One of the things that's been hardest for me, I worked on immigrant rights issues for 12 years before coming to Congress. And one of the things that's been hardest to watch is the way in which this administration has been targeting immigrants of all legal statuses, raids, a number of other things. Washington State has been a leader in making sure that we are protecting workers here, immigrant workers, small businesses, farms, and making sure that we keep the separation between federal immigration enforcement and local law enforcement. We all know that when you have local law enforcement that communities trust, it makes everyone safer. And so we have a law here called Keep Washington Working. And you have a state-based challenge to a sheriff in Eastern Washington around whether they're following the Keep Washington Working Act. I think this is one of the issues that I hear from people all the time. Perhaps people thought that Donald Trump and the administration were going to go after the worst of the worst. That's the way they described it. I put that in air quotes. But that's not what's happening. And so talk a little bit about this state challenge and how we ensure, because your job is also to ensure that people are following the laws here in Washington State, how do we ensure that our local law enforcements around the state are following the Keep Washington Working Act?
Yeah, I mean, obviously immigration enforcement in America has been going on for a long time. Presidents of both political parties have been doing federal immigration enforcement, deporting people who are here unlawfully. But what we've seen in the first 6 months of this presidential term is not just that. It is a real disregard for the humanity of people. And, from kidnapping students for their, speaking their mind on political issues or public issues, from arresting people who are going through the process and going to their immigration appointments, arresting them at those locations. There was just an article in the Seattle Times today about a raid in our
in White
Center, where they were unmasked or masked people, unmarked, grabbing people off the street and shepherding them away in vans and with no real clear identity associated with them. And it's scary, and it's having a huge impact on people. And I think it is done specifically to terrorize people. And in Washington, we have this state law that the legislature passed in 2019. It is intended to do what you said, to clarify the role and the distinction between state and local law enforcement and federal criminal immigration enforcement, and essentially puts some limitations on local law enforcement and others about how they cooperate with immigration officials on the federal level. We, as an office, have been working with sheriffs and police chiefs now for years to help them follow that law, to come into compliance. So we, as an office, develop model policies. We give that to the local law enforcement agencies, and they have to adopt their own model policies under the law. And, there have been times throughout the years where we found agencies that aren't following it completely. And so we work collaboratively with them and say, here's the deficiencies that we've seen. Here's what you need to do to come in compliance. And almost to a T, all of them have made that effort in good faith to come into the law, whether they agree with it or not.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of law enforcement officials that I've talked to in the state, in this role and prior to being in this role, because I was the U.S. attorney for Western Washington, the chief federal law enforcement officer, I've talked to sheriffs and police chiefs quite often. The vast majority of them want nothing to do with federal immigration enforcement because they don't view that as their job. They recognize the potential harms and mistrust that comes with local law enforcement officials acting like federal immigration enforcement officials. And most of them were quite comfortable with the law. Unfortunately, we've had a couple outliers. In Adams County, it was pretty clear to our office over the last couple of years that they were not doing what they needed to do to follow state law. They were cooperating with federal immigration officials. They were detaining and transporting people solely based on their status and not some other local criminal issue. They were not following and building a model policy as required by Washington state law. We worked with them, or we tried to. My office went out to Adams County, met with the sheriff and his team, talked to their legal team to get them in compliance. They kind of indicated that they were trying, but not really taking any steps. Immediately after the election in November, they sort of gave up, cut us off. They stopped using their local county prosecutor and hired the law firm that is associated with Stephen Miller, the president's chief hateful bigot immigration leader in D.C. And so it was a clear signal to me, if you're hiring the America First Legal Foundation or whatever they're called.
And you have a particular
goal. And again, reasonable people can disagree about whether that's a good law or not, how we should do this or not, but it is clearly unlawful under Washington state law. And my role, my oath of office, is to enforce Washington state law with the authority that I have. And so we brought a suit, a state-based case against Adams County and their sheriff to get them in compliance with Washington state law. And we have all the receipts that shows how they weren't following the law. They attempted to remove the case to federal court. We opposed it and we won, so it's now back in state court, and it'll proceed. I feel really confident that we'll win that case.
They brought him out to testify before us on the Judiciary
Committee.
I
know. And again, it's not fun for me to sue a government
we
official.
Want everybody to just follow the law.
Yeah, and this is not necessarily about what that sheriff believes or doesn't believe. I'm not here to challenge his beliefs. But if you're a Washington state sheriff and you're blatantly disregarding Washington state law, I'm going to sue you if I have that authority. And the other key point I'll make is that my lawsuit against that sheriff did not seek any penalties against him. It wasn't criminal, wasn't trying to, throw anybody in jail. It was simply to get a court to say, a declarative action, that this is lawful. Yeah. And we will prevail as this case proceeds.
Last question for you. This podcast is called The Power You Have. It's about helping people not to feel hopeless and helpless in the deluge of things that are coming at us, and to make sure that people keep taking action and know how powerful their voices are. So what would you say to our listeners about what they can do? What's important for them to know? What's important for them to do?
Yeah, well, I'll say two things. What I would say first and foremost is, despite the fact that we're talking about these national issues and the Supreme Court and the president and Congress, I do think that the things that people most care about, worry about, think about on a day-to-day basis, most of those decisions are happening at a state and local level. It's hard for any one citizen in this area to feel like they can change what the president is doing, but their voice is amplified at their city council, their county council, their state legislature. The things that as individuals, as parents, as members of the community that we think about, it's public safety, it's education, it's healthcare, it's environmental issues. And so many of those issues are being decided at the state capitol. I mean, the legislature, as a former state senator, they're passing 300 to 500 bills a year that are impacting people's lives here. And having worked down there, I've seen the impact of when people show up in those spaces or collectively email or reach out to their state representative or senator. And so, what's happening in DC is really important, but it's not the only place where democracy happens. Yeah. And so I would really point people towards, trying to find.
Don't take them away from us. We need them at the national level too.
But I would ask people to, find how they can.
There's so much local.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say is, the work that you're doing, the work that I'm doing, it's vital. It's important. It is the way that we fight back against the tyranny that we're seeing from the president. Yeah. But at the end of the day, it's going to be about people.
That's right.
It's going to be about their voices being heard. It's going to be about how they show up on the streets in their communities. It's going to be how they interface with each other. Yeah. If they have a neighbor or a family member who's saying something that's just not untrue, it's going to be about whether or not they say, in fact, actually, that's not right. Yeah. Or it's whether they have the bravery and the courage to say, this is the harm that I'm feeling. This is the fear that I'm feeling. And so that collective action from, Joe Citizen is going to be what makes a difference at the end of the day.
Totally agree. Attorney General Nick Brown, we are so grateful to have you as our Attorney General. And we look forward to seeing all the ways that you improve democracy.
Thank you for being my representative.
That's right. That's right. You're in my district. Perfect. Okay, everyone. Well, that's it for today's episode. Stay tuned for the next one and look out on all of my social media platforms for more content and more updates. You can find me at Rep Jayapal. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to lots more conversations on the issues that matter and the power that you have. Take care.